It is time now for question number 11 of the Summa Theologica. And before we get into it, I just want to pause for a second and give you a word of encouragement, because you are like this guy in the picture above me, and you are running a race, okay? And many videos from now, I'm going to say we've arrived at our last question of the Summa. Congratulations, those of you who have watched all of them. And it's going to be fun. It's going to be exciting, and you will have studied, done a deep dive into the Summa Theologica, and so that's an awesome thing. And I wanted to read this quote from Pope John the 22nd. Okay, he lived in the 14th century. This is the Pope that canonized St. Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas lived in the 13th century, so this was the next century. And John the 22nd, as opposed to John the 23rd, who was the one that started Vatican II many centuries later, John the 22nd said his, meaning St. Thomas Aquinas, life was saintly and his doctrine could only be miraculous because he enlightened the church more than all the other doctors. By the use of his works, a man could profit more in 1 year than if he studies the doctrine of others for his whole life. Now, this doesn't mean we don't study the doctrine of other doctors of the church. I certainly do, and I enjoy reading a variety of different sources and different angles, like the great mystics like John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila and Therese of Lisieux and John Paul II and Benedict, right? But I think arguably the Summa Theologica is the greatest book ever written in the history of Christianity other than the Bible. Okay, the Bible is top, number one, but I would argue that the Summa is number two. If you think there's anything else in contention, well, let me know. And this is what we're studying. We're studying the Summa Theologica, so congratulations. Keep going, okay? You're 11 questions into it now. This is the last of the attributes of God. Okay, so if you have memorized them, you know what they are. We started with simplicity, and then perfection, goodness, immutability, infinity, eternity, and now unity. And unlike this picture over here, typically when we think of unity, we think of harmony and brotherhood and togetherness and everybody getting along, and that's a great thing for sure. That's not what he's talking about with the unity of God. He's talking here about God being one, okay, and not many. And that's what these articles are going to get at. And remember, the first 26 questions of the Summa have to do, well, first with treatise sacred doctrine, and then it's all about God. And so we're still have a lot more to talk about God, the Trinity, and a whole lot of other things, which gets very interesting. So stay tuned. It's going to just keep on building and building and building. All right, so Article 1, whether one adds anything to being. All right, so being, whenever you hear that word, you should think of God, because God is being. God is existence. We are human beings, and we have a human nature, and we participate in the existence of God, even though we have our own essence, and we're autonomous in that way, as we've talked about. But what about one? What about unity? He says, one does not add any reality to being, but it is only a negation of division. For one means undivided being, right? This is the very reason why one is the same as being. Now, every being is either simple or compound, but what is simple is undivided, both actually and potentially. Now, think of us. We are a composite of matter and form. We have a soul. We have a body. So we are not, those two are united in a composite, but it's also divisible. It can be divided. All right. Whereas what is compound has not being, while its parts are divided. Now, the philosophical definition of death is when the soul departs from the body. Okay, when your soul leaves your body, you're dead, and that is no longer a human being. Okay, did you know that you're no longer a human being when your soul is separated from your body? You are now separated, a separated soul and a corpse. And so that's why we are not as pure of being, I guess you could say, we're because we have divisibility. But after they make up and compose it, Hence it is manifest that the being of anything consists in undivision, and hence it is that everything guards its unity as it guards its being. Now, it's interesting because we do guard our unity. We don't want our soul to separate from our body, right? Even the souls in heaven are still longing for the bodies to return, right, at the general judgment. All right, so let's move on to number 2, whether one and many are opposed to each other. Now, this is kind of like, duh, of course they are, right? You would think that would be the case, and it is the case. The one, which is the principle of number, is opposed to multitude, which is a number. And then he goes on, this is a little bit deeper, but the one which convertible with being is opposed to multitude by way of privation, as the undivided is to the thing divided. Okay, so I think the privation he's talking about here is when you have a composite, when you have a multitude of things, whereas being is simple, being is one. God is one, God is being, right? God is. God is existence itself. All right, so whether God is one. Now, if you ever got into a debate with somebody about, there being multiple gods, like some religions believe, or there being only one God, Thomas in this article gives 3 explanations for why there can only be one God, and I think they make a lot of sense. Okay, so let me take a little bit of time with this. He says, first, from his simplicity. Okay, remember I told you days ago, everything goes back to simplicity with God. For it is manifest that the reason why any singular thing is this particular thing is because it cannot be communicated to many. All right, so I have a picture of a flower over here, okay? This is a individual one flower, right? But it shares flower nature with all the billions and trillions of flowers in the world, right? But this one particular flower is unique, just like you're unique and I'm unique, even though we share human nature, right? Since that whereby Socrates is a man can be communicated to many, because there are many men, right? Whereas what makes him this particular man is only communicable to one. Therefore, if Socrates were a man, by what makes him to be this particular man, there cannot be many Socrates, so there could not in that way be many men. All right, so if what makes Socrates unique is that he is Socrates. He is a suppositum, one individual person like you and I are. That's not communicable. There's no other Dave Palmer. There's no other you. There's no other exactly this flower, right? Now, this belongs to God alone, for God himself is his own nature. All right, so God is a suppositum, but God, there are no other gods. He is God. He is his nature, and it's not communicable to any others. All right, I hope that made sense. Secondly, this is proved from the infinity of his perfection. Okay, there's 2 of the attributes of God right there. For this was shown that God comprehends in himself the whole perfection of being. If then many gods existed, they would necessarily differ from each other. Something, therefore, would belong to one that did not belong to another. And if this were a privation, then one of them would not be absolutely perfect. All right, so you think about perfection is the top of the pecking order, right? And if you had 2 perfect things, if they were at all different from each other, well, then they can't be both perfect. One of them has to be a little bit different than the other, and so it makes sense that there's one God, and this is the God that we worship, right? And thirdly, this can be shown from the unity of the world. And now this should make you think of the 5th proof for the existence of God. Think of teleology, God directing all things to their end. For all things that exist are seen to be ordered to each other, since some serve others. But things that are diverse do not harmonize in the same order unless they are ordered thereto by one. If you have young children, if you have young grandchildren, if you are a young person, and I'm talking young like 5, and I'd be very flattered if there's a 5-year-old watching this channel. If you are, kudos, because you're very smart. But we need to teach kids that the world is ordered, right? That everything kind of makes sense. And I think it does if you really look at the world. And then they begin to see that there's a unity of the world, that there's one being that's kind of pushing everything along. And that's going to be a very fundamental theme that plays out in the Summa Theologica. Okay, so Finally, whether God is supremely one, okay, like the Supreme Court is the Supreme Court of all the courts, right? And this is kind of an interesting, I'm not sure exactly why he had to kind of drive this point home, but he did, and we're covering it. Since one is an undivided being, if anything is supremely one, it must be supremely being and supremely undivided. Now, both of these belong to God. For he is supremely being, inasmuch as his being is not determined by any nature to which it is adjoined, since he is being itself. All right. And then finally, he is subsistent, absolutely undetermined, but he is supremely undivided, inasmuch as he is divided neither actually nor potentially, right? We are potentially divided because our soul and our body can separate. Anything that has life, a lizard or a squirrel, is potentially divided because it has a soul and a body. Okay, God is altogether simple, St. Thomas Aquinas says. I told you when we went over simplicity that this is going to keep coming back and back, and it does. So, all right, do you have the 7 attributes of God memorized? Can you rattle them off? If somebody were to say, tell me the 7 attributes of God, could you just say, yeah, here they are. All right. Okay, here we go. So they are simplicity, perfection, goodness, infinity, immutability, eternity, and unity. There are the 7. Get those memorized. Have them in your head, because as we move forward tomorrow into the next question is really interesting. 13 articles in this one, and it's going to be on how can God be known by a rational creature like us? Can God be known? I remember in a class I took in philosophy where the teacher said, why would that have to do with God? Doesn't that have to do with us? Us being able to know God? Shouldn't that be in the section on human nature and not divine nature? And he said, no, this has everything to do with divine nature. I'll tell you why that's the case. It's a lesson that stayed with me forever, ever since I took that class about, 15 years ago. It was really, really interesting, okay? I'll share that with you tomorrow when we talk about can God be known by the rational creature? And I thank you for your watching, and I hope you're enjoying this. We're 11 questions into the Summa, so keep trucking along. God bless you. St. Thomas Aquinas, pray for us.